So, hello everyone. Great to see you again for the second time today. And I'm with my second panel, and I'm sure you're seeing a familiar face from my first panel, which is Ravi, which from my screen is on my left. And we've got our second guest, Paul Trueman. And we'll have our third guest speaker, Daniel, who'll be joining us a bit later, probably in the next 5 minutes. And so without taking much time, I just want to give a bit of housekeeping. Please post all your questions that you may have during the course of our discussion, even as we start, within the questions tab or even in the chat, and then we'll have our technical coach with us here. We'll post them to us and we'll be able to answer those to you and share those insights, because of course your questions come first. I have my own prepared ones, but I always put those aside when it comes to your questions. And I hope you find this session engaging. I'm looking forward to it. I just finished the short course on digital trust from Isaka, and I'm eager to learn more. So I'm so excited to engage with the panelists here with me today. And the title of our session, which I'm sure you're already seeing, is Fostering Digital Trust, Frameworks, Strategies, Responsibilities, and Skills Required. So without taking up more time, I'd like to hand over to the floor. I know you've introduced yourself, Ravi, but now we're seeing a different group of people. So I'll hand over to you first to introduce yourself. Then I'll give the floor to Paul for him to introduce himself.
Well, hello twice in a day. Thank you, Nolwazi. Hello twice in a day to all of you, wherever in the world you are dialing in from. And thank you for spending yet another hour with me, and more importantly with my colleagues here on the panel. I've introduced myself earlier. I'll do it again. My name is Ravi Shankar Chaturvedi. I'm the co-founder and director of Digital Planet, where we study how digital technologies are impacting countries, corporations, communities, consumers, and the commons. And we are one of the things that we study in collaboration with MasterCard is how digital trust manifests globally. And I hope to share some of those insights here along with Paul later in the course of the panel.
And yeah, hello to everybody wherever you are. So my name is Paul Trueman. I'm Executive Vice President in the Cyber Intelligence Solutions team at MasterCard. And what that means is we don't spend time trying to think about how we protect MasterCard. There are other teams that do that. What we do is we work with everybody from governments to retailers to banks to SMEs to consumers, and try and work out how we can provide solutions that keep them safe. And some 8 years ago, we were talking about how talking about security either frightens people or weakens them at the knees quite often, because they really don't want to talk about it. And we realized that very quickly that trust is a critical part of that conversation. It's easy to talk about how do we enable trust, governments to retailers to banks to SMEs to consumers. And yeah, hopefully that's stopped now. So when we bring on, so trust has been a critical part as we talk about digital evolution, how the digital world is progressing, and Ravi and I have done many discussions about this at various levels across various companies. So delighted to be with you today, and delighted also that Daniel's been able to join us. And I think I can pass over to Daniel to do his introduction.
Thank you so much, Paul. So Daniel, we're busy doing self-introductions of you of the guest speakers. So now I'm handing the floor to you to introduce yourself to our participants.
Great, thank you so much, Nolwazi. Thanks, Ravi and Paul, for being here today. I'm Daniel Dobrygowski. I'm the head of governance and trust at the World Economic Forum. That means I oversee our work on the corporate governance of technology risks, global governance related to technology and new technologies, and most relevant today, I think, our work on digital trust. How do we ensure that senior leaders across the board are making trustworthy decisions with regard to technology so that we can decrease sort of the mistrust gap, as we call it, between individual citizens and consumers and the technologies that we rely on for so much of our work. I've been at the forum for several years. I'm one of the founders of the Center for Cybersecurity here. I'm an attorney, and I've worked in privacy and technology risk and technology governance for many years prior to coming to the forum. I'm very excited to be here, and thanks again for the time.
Thank you all for your introductions. And again, I want to say thank you, especially Ravi, you've been with us now on our second panel. Thank you all for taking your time to join us and to share your insights. I really admire what work you've accomplished so far and what you'll be sharing with us today. And I am sure the participants are looking forward to hearing your insights as well. So the way I've prepared my Q&A for all three of you, as much as I've assigned it to each of you, please feel free to jump in and share your insights as well to a question that maybe I've posed to Daniel or to Paul or to Ravi. It's not strictly a Q&A that's just for Ravi or just for Daniel or just for Paul. I'd like this to be a discussion amongst each other, as well as any questions we get from Swapcard from our participants that are watching this session over from the platform. So I think let's start from just the beginning. And before we continue and dig deeper into skills that are required and digital trust frameworks and how digital trust differs between the physical, how trust differs between the physical and the digital world, what exactly is digital trust? Because from my readings, there's no consensus really on what the definition is. But in your opinions, from your experience, what have you perceived, what have you seen in trends as the definition or as a formal, unified form of definition of digital trust?
Nolwazi, first off, I think your audiences here are in for a terrific panel. The reason I say that is because Paul, Daniel, and I are individually, we've been thinking about digital trust in our own, sort of realms. In addition to that, the three of us have been collaborating on various levels in various forums. So we've been talking about this. So your audiences are really in for a nice collaborative conversation today. Now, what is digital trust? Look, it's a tough. I'll take the first crack at it, and I invite Paul and Daniel to give their views as well. Look, it's really difficult to define digital trust. I mean, it's difficult to define trust. For millennia. Philosophers, economists, sociologists, and anthropologists have been trying to define trust in various ways. And, they all have their own definitions, which in several ways are a function of the disciplinary lens that they use to define it. So rather than get into an academic conversation, and I say that as a quasi-academic at the table, rather than get into an academic conversation about what digital trust is, I will invoke the Potter-Stewart Knott definition. Potter Stewart, famously a Supreme Court justice in the United States, former, who said, "I know it when I see it." So rather than, pull threads trying to understand what digital trust is, it's more beneficial, helpful, shall we say, to think about what trust does. You know it when you see it. Trust either is or isn't. And, it is much more shall we say, meaningful to capture the manifestation of trust than trying to define what it is. So that's kind of one thought. The second thought is really about how what trust does. I mean, and we also know, be it the physical realm or the digital realm, we know what trust does. As the late great George Shultz said, when trust is in the room, good things happen. When trust leaves the room, you can be very sure bad things will happen. So same is the case with digital trust. So when digital trust is in the sort of digital room, for lack of a better term, good things are likely to happen. So we've, in collaboration with MasterCard, and now over nearly a year now, in collaboration with in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, have been looking at this issue of digital trust. We have a lens. We look at trust. Digital trust is as that which happens when two parties interact. Two parties being the givers of trust and the guarantors of trust. Now, the givers of trust are people like you and I, all of us, human individuals. And what are we bringing to the table? We bring, among many things, two things to the table: our attitudes and our behaviors. Attitudes are what we believe, what we think, how we feel. And our behaviors are what we do. Another way to think about this is our stated preferences and our revealed preferences. Those are what we bring to the table as consumers, as users of this digital system. Now, then on the other side of the equation are guarantors of trust. Now, who are the guarantors of trust? Guarantors of trust are enterprises, businesses, the purveyors of technology, and various services that use said technologies, and institutions. What do they bring to the table? They bring two things of many things, but we can think of two broad things. The environment, which guarantees, security, privacy, accountability, rules of the road, and experience. Experience is a seamless, frictionless, safe, convenient, means of interacting and transacting. So when all these things combine and, in a harmonious way, digital trust is high. When they don't, you see friction.
Yeah, that's true. Anything to add from you, Paul or Daniel?
Yeah, I'm not gonna. I am never gonna follow Ravi with his philosophers and whatever else. But I like it. I know it when I see it, because normally trust involves an interaction. It involves two people, and of course, working as I do in MasterCard, the interaction is I want to get some goods, I want to buy something, and someone needs to be paid for it. So there needs to be trust on both sides of the equation. I know it when I see it, because it boils down to the one we use quite regularly in our business. We use the idea of recognition and knowledge. So recognition and knowledge says, firstly, I need to recognize someone, and then I need to have some knowledge about them. And if that person then behaves in a way that the knowledge that I have about them is different, then it may not be them, it may be someone else. Or if I recognize, sometimes if I recognize a man running towards me wearing a balaclava, I'm probably not inclined to go and shake his hand. I'm probably going to run the other way. So recognition is a big part. And then the knowledge you build in behind it is a really relevant metric. Now, you apply that to the digital world. Exactly the same still works, knowledge and recognition and knowledge. The only difference is you can't use your current senses. You just can't use what you see. So what you have to rely on is that other people are using tools behind the scene that can help you make better judgments. And we do that by saying, is it a reasonable site? Is it maybe a digital site I've been to before? Have I had good experiences with them in the past? If it's a bad experience, why have you gone back? But equally, we might use a Trustpilot review, or we may use social reviews, marks out of 5. So all of these things are trying to give us confidence that the person I'm dealing with is real, and that they're not going to run away with my money, and I'm going to get the goods I bought. But as well as that, just from a MasterCard perspective, we try and support that, because we try and make sure, for example, that we can tie the device to the person, to their biometrics, to elements of their account. So generally, we want genuine consumers to have as frictionless experience as possible, because convenience and security is what we're aiming for. That's scalable. But at the same time, if something's looking doubtful, like a bot play or a digital farm, that we can pull those out and make it really difficult for them to interfere in the genuine consumer's journey. So that's how we look at it, recognition and knowledge.
I think just to add to what Paul was saying too, ultimately, and Ravi as well, ultimately trust is about the expectations of the people interacting, right, in Ravi's words. And technology especially is more trustworthy when it meets those expectations. And looking at individuals, looking at companies, organizations that we've convened in the Forum's digital trust community around the world, those expectations are around protecting the interests of all stakeholders, end users, companies, institutions, or in Ravi's words, the grantees and the guarantors of digital trust, about protecting their interests and upholding their expectations and their values. And that's ultimately the crux of what being trustworthy is all about. It's something that, again, to use Ravi's terms about guarantors, it's something that the guarantors of digital trust earn, rather than something that's just sort of given or should be expected. So it requires actual activity and dedication to some of the principles around acting in a trustworthy way.
Mm. Thank you all. That was thank you for the in-depth answer that really speaks on actual practical things, because sometimes you hear the topic digital trust and you think, oh my goodness, it's this out of this world long complicated answer, but it's back down to the ground. I know it when I see it. I know it and I trust it because I've used it often, or I trust I trust it. My trust is about expectation from the transaction or the service that I've used. Because, like example, e-commerce. Some e-commerce websites I trust because I've used them regularly in the past before. Everything was e-commerce and they've always been consistent, and I'll stick with them even though there's fancier e-commerce out there. But I'll stick with this one and the minor problems they may have. Better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. So exploring further on that, and you touched a bit on it, Paul, and as well Daniel, how can you further explore, and this includes you, Ravi, the difference between trust in a physical world and in the digital world? Because you touched on it briefly, where in the digital world, you can't see the person you're transacting with, or the legal entity or the person, as opposed to when you walk into a shop, like say here in South Africa, I walk into Woolworths and I know that I'm buying my frozen fruit. I can see it, I pick it up, I put it in the trolley and I go pay. And there's no thought of what if it disappears when I get home and I don't get my delivery? I know it's there, it's in my car. So how now does trust differentiate or change between the physical world and the digital world? Because this now becomes an important factor in whether a digital economy will result in economic growth or turn people back to the informal world in sector, or turn people back to cash is king life.
Can I step in first and go for that one? So like I said, the metric of, for me, the metric of recognition and knowledge is a pretty damn useful one, because that applies to everything. And like I said, different technologies will come at this different ways. But understand that, to your point of where you shop and the fact you've used this site regularly, that's a kind of trust you've built up over time. And as you said, you look past their minor inconveniences because you know you can trust them. And when you buy something in Woolworths, you're buying something right there and then. And therefore, you're looking at the person. You know that if it's not right, like when you get home, that fruit's not right, you can bring it back to Woolworths because they will be there tomorrow. Whereas in the digital world, you can't rely on that. What you see is what you get at that moment, and it could disappear. Or if you buy something of sufficient value, how do you know the person is going to deliver it to you? So we know this, and we also know that gets caught up in first things like, first party fraud. So I think there is a point of, just as much as we need to work out who we're going to trust, say, as a retailer, the retailer also needs to know that whoever's buying something from them, that is worth a lot of value, that they can trust you. And so that it's a symbiotic relationship, and both need to know that there is a traceability back to who you are. So for example, if someone comes online, should someone type something in and say, I'm using this device to pay for something, and yet that device hasn't been seen before, or the email associated was set up 2 days ago. There's various things we can do and look at in the system and say, look, this is quite risky, because none of these things point to a long-term relationship, or this person having a long-term bind between the individual device and then how they use it and the email account, etc. So there are indications you can use at the moment. If we get on later to talk about what the future will be in the metaverse, then that shows up a whole stack more things. But I would normally, I'm going to give 3 quick hints and things I would think about doing, because you did say before, how can people online kind of work out what to do? General line is if you see something online that's just too good to be true, then it probably is. So trying to get something pushed through at low price and buy within the next 20 minutes is normally a sign of a problem. Second one was, I said knowledge. So if the knowledge you have about them doesn't line up with how they're behaving, it's not good either. So that's probably someone scamming. Think about it. If you have a friend who borrows £2 off you, or $2, that's fine. If suddenly they turn up to you one day and say, can I borrow $5,000? You might look at them in a different way. That's not how they normally behave. So you can ask questions. And the final one, I was at a conference last week in Venice. Someone said this, and I said, people have this thing that when a scam's going to be really obvious to spot because criminals make spelling mistakes. Let's be clear, they don't, because this is a $6 trillion criminal activity now. $6 trillion makes it, if it was a country, the GDP would be the third biggest country in the world, right behind China and America. Criminals are making mistakes in spelling, but you can't rely on that as a means by which to identify criminals, because they're going to stop making mistakes if they're going to catch you. So the biggest failure still remains individuals clicking through on things that you really should have thought a little bit more about before they do it. Anyway, I'm going to pass over to my smarter friends who are going to give me a great answer on the piece. Daniel, do you want to have a crack?
Sure. Yeah, I think, Paul, look, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? We're looking for all these indicators of what's trustworthy and what's not in the digital world. And it's because in the real world, in the physical world, I guess everything's real, right? In the physical world, we have millions of years of evolution and tens of thousands of years of human interaction to fall back on that sort of built these indicators for us, right? You can see someone face to face. You expect things from how they act. You expect things from how they sound. And those are all indicators that are sort of hardwired in our brains for trustworthiness. And that leads to the point of what do we do in the digital world? We need to hardwire these indicators of trustworthiness into the digital world. We need to design in opportunities for trustworthiness. So that means things like ensuring, cybersecurity by design, privacy by design. All of these need to be thought of from the ground up when we're developing new technologies and applying old ones, so that we can ensure that those indicators of trustworthiness are recognizable to everybody, are the same across different technologies. They're interoperable. Trust is ultimately the ultimate thing to design into any system. So we need a movement toward trust by design that takes into account all of these things. What do you think, Ravi?
Well, I fully agree with everything that you and Paul said, Daniel. A couple of thoughts come to mind, and we seem to be thinking about individual responsibility. Well, there is undoubtedly institutional responsibility. There is the responsibility of the producers and purveyors, as we talk about trust by design, and then there is individual responsibility. In some sense, the flip side of convenience is complacence. And as things become convenient, and Paul just gave an example of that, right? So it is important for consumers to be able to exercise judgment before clicking. Just because it is easy to click doesn't mean you click on it. And so, I'm just going to take the liberty of updating the Peter Parker principle to the digital age. With great access comes great responsibility. So, in some sense, providing the givers, which is users and consumers of trust, the tools to move towards what we should think about as intelligent trust will create a safer, secure, and more socially cohesive digital environment. So, and that responsibility is collective. Collective in the sense of collective being, producers, purveyors have a responsibility for it. Institutions have a responsibility, and individuals, as we've been talking, have a role to play.
Thank you all so much for your answers. I think you all hit the nail on the head, that there's so many different aspects to think about when you're looking at the difference between your physical and digital trust, and that there's also measurement indicators that you need to think about. And I'll come back to that because that's the second question on how those indicators need to be understood, that they're not static, but they evolve over time because technology itself is also evolving over time. But I want to come back to now a question that I wanted to ask Ravi in the sense that, in your opinion, as you mentioned, this is an organizational aspect, and it's not an individual institution or individual person issue. What skills do you think organizations in the digital ecosystem still need to develop to better able foster digital trust with their consumers?
Right. And enterprises do have a role, right? In addition to, and that's a terrific question, in addition to everything that we've been talking about, trust by design is a role of enterprises, right? Producers, purveyors of technology. Now, and all the products and services that said technologies enable. Now, in addition to that, I think enterprises would do well to build a sensing function of what your consumers think and feel, and an observation function of what they actually are doing, and measuring the convergence or divergence between these two. Shall we call it the attitudes and the behaviors, right? And as long as they move in tandem and on the higher side, things are good. When there are disconnects is when you need to pay particular attention to what's going on. So a sensing function is important, as well as a strong, observing function.
Thank you, Ravi. Paul and Daniel, do you want to add anything to that?
I think what Ravi said, we do look at attitudes and behaviors. I think that's, what people say they're going to do, and then what people do may not be the same thing. Because in isolation, when they're asked a question about, do you trust this? Well, the best example is polls, when you're polling politicians. Do you trust these people? Are you going to vote for them? And then what they do can be quite often different, which is why, polling makes a lot of money and then sometimes doesn't get it quite right. Because people then faced with the bigger decision make different things. And goes back to, the question or the point Ravi raised at the beginning is, I know when I see it. Trust is an interaction at some point between someone and something, and you've got to decide whether you're going to go for it or you're not going to go for it. And to your point you made earlier on, was the one which you said, if people don't get what they are, maybe they'll turn back to cash. I mean, think how far we'd have to go back to turn back to cash, when at the moment people are now looking towards what's happening with NFTs and cryptocurrencies, etc. But there's learnings in there for every institution. So at the moment, in the crypto exchanges, there's a lot of crypto exchanges out there. Over 50% of them that we know don't follow what we'd regard as reasonably safe behavior. They don't understand how to use KYC. They don't understand about anti-money laundering. Therefore, they're at risk at every point of a criminal being able to do something with them, take that money off them, or there may be criminals in there themselves. And the fact is that undermines cryptocurrency's capability. It's a really interesting technology. In the hands of businesses using it well, it will actually help society. And it has some, whatever's happening in terms of when you think about, distributed ledger technology, there's some really great technology in there. But when people are looking sometimes to make quick money, they're evolving their systems quite quickly, and they follow the old evolve and launch principle, which really was behind technology businesses. And that's great. But if in doing so, they leave the door open behind them to potential weaknesses in their systems, then criminals will find it and they will exploit it, and people will lose money and be hurt. So we're trying to encourage fintechs to think about how they do things in the right way. Everybody's trying to do the right thing, but try and do it in a way that they don't leave themselves exposed. Because at the end of the day, it will be their customers and their business that will fold on the basis that they didn't think hard enough about how to keep everything safe and how to ensure trust was retained in the ecosystem.
Definitely. And on that, you're actually leading me to a question I wanted to ask Daniel, which is, we've all recently seen the news and all the publications around every country suddenly now wants to find a way to regulate crypto assets. And they're trying to benchmark, see how other countries are doing it. So I'm asking this to Daniel, but obviously Ravi and Paul, please feel free to add your thoughts. That with increasing regulation and consumer expectations about privacy and other values, how can financial sector authorities organizations adapt their policies and approaches to increase trust around crypto assets and their usage, for example, such that their privacy is still maintained and protected, and that they don't feel too constrained, because there is an opportunity to use them. They have various applications, which is why we've seen the boom in interest in CBDCs. But there's also the risks. There are also the risks that Paul has just mentioned right now, and people would end up shying away, or other countries will end up being de-risked and so on, from cross-border payments, and people really having to resort to the crypto wallets, where in some countries they just are flat out, no, you're not allowed to run this business, and people are trapped and they can't transfer money. So how can regulation balance this with the risks, but also ensuring that people's trust in these exchanges is maintained, because their privacy and protection is sound?
And I think that's a great question. The crypto example, I think, and the wider regulatory milieu in which this sits is really an interesting kind of case study in the breakdown of trust, especially the breakdown of trust of technology, but also breakdown of trust around institutions and organizations, right? I mean, at its origins, crypto itself kind of comes from a bet that institutions aren't going to be the only ones, government institutions aren't going to be the only ones who can mint currency, right, in the future. And that comes from a breakdown of trust that's been happening over the last century in government institutions especially. And I think that the reverse of that, this increased regulation of crypto, but also increased regulation of technology across the board, is a symptom of the wider breakdown in trust between governments and technology developers and providers as well. And I think we're going to see increasingly more and more regulation around, like you said, privacy, around cybersecurity, around crypto assets. And I think all of these things are a function of this kind of breakdown in trust. It's because technology developers, providers, and users have not been acting in ways that the individual person on the street, a government official, they've not been acting in ways that those folks deem to be trustworthy. So the reaction on the government side is to regulate, right? And organizations, institutions, companies haven't been acting in ways, government institutions have been acting in ways that the individual on the street sees as trustworthy either. So they're going to look for other models. And thanks to this digitized world, there are other models. I don't need to use the currency of the government that controls the land I live in. I can use some other currency. And so you see this sort of this cycle of distrust kind of building, and people trying to find new avenues, trying to find something that they can trust, something they can believe in order to maintain their day-to-day life, in order to innovate, even in order to develop new ideas. So I think that all of this is really just a function of this trust breakdown. And I think in order to kind of understand how to begin solving these issues, begin getting to a place where we have more reasonable and sort of reflective regulation, better business practices, and better understanding of individuals, it comes from, we need to start with developing better practices around trustworthy technology. We need to make sure that we, the developers of technology, the people who use it, the people who own these big technology companies and institutions, we need to make sure that we're acting in trustworthy ways, so that we don't end up with these sort of knee-jerk reactive policies in place.
Thank you, Daniel. And this perfectly leads, I like how the conversation is flowing as I pictured it in my head, because this perfectly leads me to my question to Ravi on digital trust frameworks, which, as he also acknowledged, are an excellent approach for organizations to demonstrate their digital trust to their consumers. However, recent statistics indicate that approximately 45% of fintech startups, for example, fail within the first 5 years. So, and one of the main reasons they fail is that they don't conduct consumer research for product development. So they're out here developing solutions which aren't addressing existing problems. And that will definitely be a big hit, because a big snap for them, because now they have a product that's not solving for anything or fit for purpose for that specific market that they're in. Maybe it will work for a different country, but for the country they're in, it's not working. So, and I'm asking you, Ravi, but obviously, as I said again, Paul and Daniel, please feel free to add your thoughts. How would you advise startups and already established organizations to develop their digital trust framework, and whose responsibility would it be exactly? So this will be our last question, because we have 10 minutes left now.
I'll try to take as little of those 10 minutes as possible, because I really am more curious to hear about what Paul and Daniel have to say on this question. So as someone who is a producer and purveyor of research and insights, it's very self-serving for me to say more research is good. But I will, it's entirely understandable that, irrespective of whether you're an early to late stage startup, a fintech, or even an established organization. So I'll borrow from my own experiences. Before I co-founded Digital Planet, I was a banker. So they call me a recovering banker here in academic circles. In my early product management days, building payment products, I never had fancy budgets to go do research. So what I did was walk around the organization, ask users, employees, saying, hey, if you're a consumer, what would you do? It was a quick dipstick of what would you do if, what kind of features, if this is the product, what would you like in this card back in the day? But anyway, instrument, what features would you like? How would you use said feature? So there are ways to do that and get around, very expensive, consumer research. That being said, I think in the digital system, if there is one thing that fintechs, because you asked me a question about fintechs, and not just fintechs, but anybody who's in the business of building digital products and services, the one thing that they want to pay attention to is experience. So lately, I've been fascinated with this notion of rage clicking. Rage clicking is when you repeatedly either tap your device or click on, repeatedly click. It's the equivalent of road rage of some kind, but because we've all been behind our screens for about 2.5 years, there is an element of rage clicking that happens, and that happens because of something that is not working at the back end. Either the interface that isn't functioning properly. There could be three of many kinds of friction, right? There is access friction. It is probably because the device itself, is old and can't keep up. Or the bandwidth that you're working with is less than optimal. Or it could be transactional friction. You're trying to hit pay, but you get that pinwheel of death. Or it is just bad UX. So of these aspects, think of these as frictions of access, of transaction, and and of infrastructure, or frictions of access, infrastructure, and interaction. Think about those aspects of friction and do your best. I mean, again, if it is bandwidth related friction, well, there is something that you can do about it. Facebook, the organization, formerly known as Facebook, Meta now, introduced something called 2G Tuesdays, because people working in the Bay Area had no comprehension of what it means to access Facebook in a 2G environment. So what they did was deliberately lower the internet speeds so developers could understand what it means to access Facebook in a 2G environment. So when you sit and think about, so that is well within your control, and it is far less expensive than trying to engage in, expensive research and hiring people like me.
That's a really interesting example, and I think I've heard so many times, and I was encouraged when I'm listening to universities talk about innovation sessions when they come on, and they tend to tell me that there's a problem that exists in the planet, and then they tell me that they've got an app that's going to solve it. And I invariably think you've got to put realistic as to what you're going to get. And to your point, Nolwazi, is who's your market? You're real clear on who you're targeting and what you're going to do, and what does good look like, or you keep banging on that. But I kind of want to take a little bit of a view, because Ravi's point was very interesting about rage click. And I'm going to give an example of a recent type of attack, which is, I like doing attacks, but I also want to pick up on what Daniel said earlier on, which is the convergence of how technology is going, consumers are interacting, and how regulation is changing. So in the UK, or in Europe, actually, because of really well thought out rules around PSD2, etc., trying to make sure, and GDPR, how to make sure that people's data was safe and the privacy element was there, really well thought out. One of the things they asked you to do is to make sure that you have to give your consent for a site. Now, what that ended up in manifesting itself in Europe is that every time you go to a site today on Europe, the first thing it does before it lets you play in there is accept the cookies or personalize which cookies you're going to accept. Now, that's built in a human behavior, which is as soon as you arrive on the site, you press all cookies. So frankly, I'm giving away more rights than I was probably before, because just the way it's constructed. And so there's a point where you go, the nuances of technology meets regulation have got to be constantly considered in terms of, are the consumers just accepting and walking themselves into a trouble or not? And just to pick Ravi's point, I've seen recently a type of attack that's coming, which is continually pushing authentication notices to people. So they say, you need to authenticate. People go, yeah, I'm fed up with that. And eventually they click through. And one of those can be, they can hit you with a number of these. And then you're authenticating through. And what you've just done is authenticate yourself into a false site. So criminals are very good at working out how to understand human behavior and where the weaknesses and fallibility are. And all of those things, every time they happen, undermine trust. So to the point recently of people, you know, to Ravi's point is someone getting a text saying, hey, mum, my phone's broken. I just not getting, can we have a chat? And then suddenly next thing the person's getting scammed. They play on human behaviors, and we've got to watch out for that and try and help people avoid those sort of things going forward. But we've all got a part to play. So, Daniel.
The unintended consequence, Paul, of GDPR is we've created a cookie monster, Frankenstein.
Unintended consequences of technology apply to everywhere at all points. There's technology is great, but smart people will work out how to use that technology in a different way. And we've just always got to be one step ahead of that wherever possible.
Totally.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I think that, you know, Paul, your point about, you know, criminals being good studies of human behavior. I sometimes feel like the cyber criminals especially understand human behavior better than regulators and better than people run major companies sometimes are too. And I think we need to get better at that on the good guys side, I guess, in order to rebuild trust. And getting back to the question about, you know, especially, you know, companies, you know, fintech companies that are designing new and innovative technology solutions to the problems that we see. I will say, and this, you know, might seem harsh, but if you're not designing your technology and your organization to prioritize security, if you're not designing them to prioritize privacy, if you're not prioritizing ethics in the technology use, then you're not building a sustainable and long-term organization. And you're not building technology that's really helping solve these problems. Ultimately, you need to focus on these dimensions of trust in order to be both responsible as a technology developer and user and as a company, but also in order to actually solve some of the issues we're getting to. And looking at, you know, since the pathways to 17, we're talking about the SDGs. You know, it's not just about, you know, SDG 9 or SDG 15, right? It's all of these SDGs can be helped along by useful technology applications, but those applications have to be trustworthy. And that's hopefully what we're getting to by building in things like security, privacy, ethics in the design stage. Back over to you, Nolwazi.
Thank you so much for your insights. I really have, I'm not sure if you've been saying that I've been jotting down points from what I'm just learning from you. And I really appreciate all that you've shared. I mean, I prepared my questions from what I've learned, but I've learned even more from your answers and your discussions. And so I want to say thank you, as our admin has told us we have about 2 minutes left, so I won't take more of that time. So thank you so much to you, Ravi, Paul and Daniel, for taking your time to join us. I know the audience has also enjoyed listening to this session. But my first question, someone in the discussion said, I wanted to ask that question. So I'm glad that I helped someone else out who was curious about the same thing. And
validation, it was a good question, Nolwazi.
Thank you, because I took the course on digital trust and I was like, okay, this was great, but let's really go deeper into this definition, because I feel like they just scratched the surface. So I really appreciate your expertise and your depth of knowledge. And I'm glad that the participants also did. And I look forward to seeing you in future speaking engagements. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to all the participants that have joined us in this time.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks all.
Goodbye.